So welcome everybody. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us here at the EUHealthGov seminar. My name's Eleanor Brooks. I'm one of the coordinators of the research network, along with Charlotte Godziewski, who's here, and Mary Guy, who is on the call as well. We're really pleased to see you all. Thanks for coming to join us. This is our 6th, 7th, something like that, seminar of the season, and we're really pleased that our very own Charlotte is going to chat to us today about her new book, The Politics of Health Promotion. So we're not going to make this super duper formal, but Charlotte's going to speak for a few minutes just to introduce the book and the core arguments and how she's gone about putting together the book. And then we have a sort of semi-structured Q&A where I will pick Charlotte's brains for a little while, and then we'll open it up to a wider Q&A for everybody else. I'll ask everyone that's on the call just to mute themselves if they can, just so that I can't hear myself and Charlotte can't hear herself, which is always a bit nicer. And I'll mute myself in a minute just to sort that out for you, Charlotte. For now, maybe I just give you the floor and you can have a few minutes, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards and then open it up to everybody else. So go ahead, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Ellie. Thank you very much, everyone, for logging in. So this book is about the research that I've done over the last 6-7 years or so. And I would like to start talking a little bit about its cover. So I don't know if you've seen it. I would say I'm judge a book by its cover, but on this occasion, I really thought a long time about what I wanted to use as an image. So as you can see, it's like a crack in concrete with a plaster on top of it. And I think that captures kind of quite well the kind of arguments that I wanted to develop in the book. So the plaster here kind of represents the superficiality of how health promotion tends to be understood. So it seems that health promotion tends to be an afterthought in the decision-making sphere, and that is despite the massive scale of preventable non-communicable diseases. So you know, health promotion is often thought of only in terms of let's encourage people to behave healthily. And given the scale of the issue, I thought surely that can't be all that health promotion has to offer in the areas of NCDs. And that begs the first kind of set of questions that I reflect on in this book, which is simply, what is health promotion even in the first place? What should it be? And what should be its scope? And at the starting point, I kind of reject the idea that it's just about shaping behaviors. But then, of course, this is not at all a novel take. Look at recent or even much less recent research on NCDs, you quickly realize that, you know, there is a real mismatch between research and policy. And now, in particular, research looks at politics, at inequities, at food systems, capitalism. You know, now there's a lot of work on NCDs and complexity theory. And so if you would take that research to come up with a definition of health promotion, it would be radically broader than just behavior. But policy and popular wisdom arguably seems to be stuck in a narrow kind of view of health promotion. And so in that sense, what I meant with the title, The Politics of Health Promotion, is much more like defining the contours of health promotion, deciding what is and isn't about health. And that's political, and that has to do with power dynamics. And so that leads me to the second step in the book, and in the sort of central puzzle of the book. Why is so much of this very important research not reflected in practice, despite very good efforts to propose really interesting progressive policy agenda? And at the core here, I was interested in the relationship between research and policy and how that plays out in an institutional setting, and in this particular case, in the EU. And so to study this empirically, I decided to look at an agenda called Health in All Policies, so abbreviated HIAP, which was first introduced in the EU officially by the Finnish presidency, EU presidency in 2006. And the concept of HIAP is based on recognizing that basically non-health policy areas do affect health, and that if we want to improve population-wide health and well-being, policies that you know are in any domain need to consider how they shape health. And so this is very much an attempt to address this mismatch that I was talking about before between research and policy, and to bring about a more kind of sophisticated understanding of health promotion into policy. But interestingly, HIAP was welcomed at the EU level, but did not, at the same time, did not really lead to any fundamental change towards a more meaningfully healthier way to govern the EU. And that's the sort of the last part of my central puzzle in the book. What's happening? So why did HIAP turn out the way it did? How can we say it's both kind of, succeeded in reaching the EU, but also didn't succeed in having a really meaningful impact? And so in a nutshell, there are three main points that are proposed here. First, that HIAP kind of struggles to spark change quite simply because of institutional constraints. So areas that are dealt with in the most kind of harder binding ways tend to be the ones that have the least perceived relevance to health, although they are precisely the ones that should be considered in health and health policies. So, for example, single market regulation, but also fiscal and economic governance since the Eurozone crisis and so on. And on the other hand, the areas that have the most perceived relevance to HIAP are in the end still limited to health policies or public health policies, and those are governed quite softly. So you have the issue with silos, but at the same time very asymmetric silos where the health is siloed out and is much weaker, and other things don't have a perceived relevance to health. But secondly, I would argue that these institutional constraints don't just exist out of the blue, and they don't also sustain themselves out of the blue. And so there's an ideational dimension at play here as well. And so structure, ideas structure how people make sense, for example, of health, how health is framed, but also they structure how evidence and knowledge is made sense of. So in the EU, for example, what constitutes legitimate, usable evidence ends up often being very kind of metric driven and quantifiable. And this is very difficult when you have a policy agenda like a health and health policy, which is much more difficult to quantify. And so in that sense, it kind of pushes epistemological boundaries. Yeah. And then third and final point is, sorry, don't know what happened here. Third and final point is that the EU is less, it's less about the EU and more about the concept of HIAP itself. And here I argue that HIAP is one of those so-called chameleonic ideas, and they are intentionally vague and intentionally kind of set up to fit the EU space. And HIAP has to kind of grapple with its own radicality and try and tone it down so that it doesn't become perceived as too out there and too radical for the EU governance space. And this is strategically done. And what you have then is, as a result, an idea that travels well and that can get kind of traction and that you can reach the EU space, but at the same time, that becomes very easy to water down and co-opt and change. And so that the last point that I'm trying to make is that, the very agenda of HIAP contains this sort of tension between trying to build consensus and build a constituency around it, and holding on to its radical essence. And that might also kind of contribute to why it's been accepted, but failed to lead to any radical change. So these are kind of in a nutshell the arguments and main points that I address in the book. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Charlotte. That was a very concise overview of the book. I'm going to hold the book up again so that everybody can see. The book is this book, which is available now and published by Palgrave in their Science, Knowledge and Policy series. And yeah, a bit of context on our discussion, I suppose. So for those who are around in London, Charlotte will be doing a launch of the book in person on the 13th of October, and I am delighted to have been invited to be the discussant for that. So both Charlotte and I will be at that event on the 13th. So this was a nice opportunity for us to have a first discussion a bit more informally about the book itself now that I've read it and the work that Charlotte's done. So I'm going to jump in with a few questions, but then we're going to leave lots of time for Q&A because there's plenty of people in the audience who will have far more informed things to ask than me for a start off, and a great deal of interest, I'm sure. But I guess, so Charlotte, just to start off with, can you say a little bit more, maybe perhaps even on a slightly more personal level, if that was appropriate, about your motivation for writing the book? Like, what was the puzzle that you saw that you thought, okay, this is what I'm going to spend my 3 years of PhD on and what I'm going to focus my book on when I'm finished? What bothered you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in this particular case, the personal is quite important, because my my trajectory is one that kind of led me to politics in a rather kind of convoluted way, because I have an undergraduate degree in dietetics and nutrition. And so I come from a natural science kind of background, and I spent a couple of years working in Nepal in a hospital as a dietitian. And as a young 21, 22-year-old, I didn't really understand much. I didn't really know much about issues like, for example, the nutrition transition. And so I didn't really expect that much non-communicable diseases, diet-related non-communicable diseases, to be there in Nepal. I was expecting completely different sets of issues, which were, of course, also there. But and that kind of got me thinking a bit more about the limits of what we can achieve with a sort of a biomedical paradigm of thinking about diet-related non-communicable diseases, and how that issue might be much more political and have to do with political economy. And so that's why this sort of core this core puzzle related to a concern of how to improve the situation in terms of the non-communicable diseases epidemic, but also the kind of epistemological kind of dilemmas between public health and critical social sciences. That was also something that it was particularly interesting to me, because I'd gone to a sort of a transition there in how I was thinking about research myself. And then you have the element of the EU, why I chose to focus on the EU. And I think there it's, on one hand, it's also personal past dependencies, because I did an internship at the European Health Alliance before starting my PhD. But also, I also think the EU is a particularly interesting case to look at, because you have these asymmetric power dynamics. It's a sphere that is often understood to be particularly neoliberal, and yet you do have health and policy. So I thought it was particularly interesting to look at the EU in that respect as well.
That makes a whole lot of sense. I wanted to ask you about this macro social determinants of health concept, because you use it in the book, and I think certainly from the literature that I engage with on EU health stuff, one of the major contributions the book makes is that it engages with this term, right, that we don't use very often, and that it looks to these much more upstream or distal, or whatever term we want to use for these sort of higher up, further away from the individual determinants of health. So I wondered if you would reflect a bit on how you found that, I guess practically how you came across it and why you thought it was relevant, and how you found it to use, and maybe why you think it's important.
I mean, I think the reason why I think talking about macrosocial determinants of health is important, and in particular in relation to the EU, was in response to people arguing that the EU had nothing to do with health. Which I encountered, in some places, to think, well, public health is a member state competency, so your topic, your research topic, is not even legitimate almost, right? And so I think there it's kind of important to look at not just to take a broader understanding of what governing health means, and take into consideration all these areas that impact health indirectly. And there's so much research looking at how inequalities and inequities impact health, that actually you could argue that anything that impacts inequalities also impacts health, right? I think nowadays, especially since the pandemic, I think it's difficult to argue that the EU has nothing to do with health anymore in the same way as maybe some years before. But I guess, in the way that which the EU affects health, I'd say there's on one hand, the research that, for example, people like Scott Greer do, that is, how regulation of single markets or fiscal coordination affects health services or, health systems, but via a different avenue, via the avenue of economic coordination, via the avenue of single market regulation. Whereas the point I'm trying to make is that even if it doesn't affect health systems or health care, it still affects these determinants of health, which is an even more kind of indirect point to make. But I think one that is really important. And also then, jumping on that, I would also say that I'm not necessarily, the book is not necessarily calling for more EU in health, because I remain quite agnostic about, the appropriate amount of EU involvement in health, but more health in the EU, more health in what's already in the EU.
I think that's a really nice way of encapsulating that idea, and probably one that is shared by a fair few people on the call, that there's not necessarily this normative agenda behind anything that we do, that most of us feel a bit undetermined about how much EU there should be in health, but that's a really nice way of summarising why we do what we do, I suppose. Just on the EU case study, because you and I have spoken a bit about this before, and we've both faced challenges, I guess, in different pieces of work with the generalizability of what we find out about the EU and health, right? Because it both shares characteristics with other federal governments and regionalised structures and things, but it is also sui generis in that very literal term, where there isn't anything really directly comparable. And a lot of what we know from the national level or the international level doesn't map perfectly onto what we then see happen at EU level. So I was struck in the book because you talk a bit about Finland's experience with health in all policies, and that got me thinking about the potential of a comparative kind of angle where we look a bit at the difference between how the EU was able or not able to adopt a health in all policies frame, and how Finland was or wasn't able to, and what the differences might be. So in the Finnish case, as I understand from the book, it had a lot to do with political parties and the makeup of the government and the parliament and things, and that's a bit less true in the EU case, just because of the nature of the beast. So I'm basically putting the puzzle out there and wondering if you have any thoughts on how we address this issue about how we generalize what we learn about health in the EU case and use it in other areas.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and I think, one thing that's maybe lacking in the book is more engagement with national levels and member states, and this sort of multi-levelness of governance is definitely something I want to explore in the future. And I think it kind of leads back to the tension between identifying structures and general global trends that you can see, like neoliberalization and so on, versus looking at agency and contextual specificities. And so I think the EU is very interesting because it has that unique institutional setup, but at the same time, asymmetries, I'm sure, can be found in other governance level because of the multi-levelness of that characterizes EU member states right now. And Finland, for example, I know Finland, is often taken as a success story for health in all policies, but at the same time, in the 90s, when it accessed the EU, but also before, there had been some kind of reforms that kind of were moving away from a sort of a health in all policies approach to governing, and they've not been immune to these sorts of global trends either. So you have some similarities there, but in terms of generalizability, one thing that I would say, which is maybe not exactly answering your question, but it's more the chameleonic nature of the policy agenda that I find is such a trend, that you find recycled versions of that in so many different areas. And I think we can look not just at health, but also gender mainstreaming kind of echoes a lot, faces the similar kinds of challenges. And health in all policy, people are talking less perhaps now about health in all policies and more about inclusive growth. And these are kind of all similar agendas that face the same challenges between radicality and co-option. And I think that's quite interesting, because that seems to be really prevalent nowadays, especially in the context of all these crises, overlapping crises that we have right now. So yeah, I think that's something that has applicability, I think, as well.
Yeah, I agree. And the you don't cover it in great detail, but the parts that you mention in the book about the comparison to the experience with gender mainstreaming is really interesting, because that one feels a bit more like it's been a little bit more successful because it's a bit more tangible. How to do it seems a bit more known and a bit more graspable, which is definitely not a word, than health in all policies, where to actually do it properly is immensely complex. And gender mainstreaming is complex, but in a slightly less insurmountable way, I think, than health in all policies. And that sort of, that puzzle comes out in the book a little bit, I think. I wanted just to pick up on the neoliberalism point, because one of the major strengths of the book is that it doesn't adopt what I would characterize personally as quite lazy perception of the EU as monolithically neoliberal, as you mentioned in the introduction. Like, it doesn't assume, as many texts do, that the EU is unavoidably and unitarily and across all fronts neoliberal. But in in exploring the nuance of that and the possibilities for different parts of the EU or even different parts of the Commission or the Council or whatever to have a different view on that, I wonder if I could just push you on sort of examples, like how does that manifest? Where are the places and who are the people who are able to push against that sort of neoliberal paradigm in what you found in the book?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting observation, and I have to say that it wasn't easy for me to also grapple with that, with kind of like avoiding these deterministic, like, oh, everything is neoliberalism versus, you know, looking only at agencies. So finding the right balance there was something that was quite difficult in the research process. And I also agree with you that, you know, neoliberalism is a concept that's been so overstretched and so used to kind of mean everything that's bad, kind of, you know, and then it kind of loses it becomes less useful, right? But at the same time, I couldn't avoid it either, because, you know, when you travel up the so-called upstream path of determinants of health, that's also kind of where you land. So I had to try and find a way to look at it in a way that says something interesting. And so on one hand, what I tried to do is, as you say, explore irregularities, explore spaces where it's spaces for resistance, basically. And there are some examples that I touch upon in the book. So, for example, those can be found in the European Parliament. There was a whole conference that one of my interviewees told me about degrowth, and, you know, the person kind of was telling me how, okay, you know, this kind of health and policy agenda speaks a lot to degrowth ideas, which are much more radical than health and policies. There are also some spaces in the Joint Research Center to explore kind of a bit more radical ideas. So I find that, yeah, these were maybe a surprise also to me, but also, you know, the very fact that health and policy made it in council conclusions, and that it is present in some spaces in the EU agenda, I think that's also already shows that it's not monolithical, because if it was monolithical, then how could it even make, you know, how could it even reach there, you know? So this is also a sign. And then also speaking to people, you saw that that it's the realities and constraints that make the whole situation much more messy. So I spoke to one interviewee, an EU policymaker, who we spoke about the issues with conceptualizing health promotion as an economic investment. And the person was really explaining to me that this was not their personal preference, or that they were well aware of the limits of that frame, but it was simply a pragmatic kind of strategy to get it higher on the agenda. So you can see that it's, you know, you have a lot of space for trying to spark more incremental changes, which I think you know, came across thanks to the fieldwork in Brussels
Right.
and Luxembourg and Finland as well. Yeah.
I think your methodological approach also really, that was what gave you the space to find that. I think if you hadn't been using the discursive institutionist framework that you were using, and you were just using a really heavily institutional framework, I imagine it would have been much more difficult to find those spaces for resistance that you came across, since they're based on that, yeah, on that sense of ideas and discourses and how people challenge things in that way. Yeah, it's a real central contribution of the book to me. Another thing I wanted to flag up, just because I was so completely in awe of how much literature you engage with and how many different fields of literature, which then makes me feel very nervous about being qualified to say anything about how what you've done fits into the literature, because I'm only an expert in some of the smaller groups of literature that you engage with, but particularly the literature on evidence and policy, which I know very little, but I'm by no means an expert in. I wanted to press you a bit on solutions. So the book does a really good job of engaging with that literature and distilling down this idea that part of the problem is that we need an EU policy process that makes space for the kind of evidence that tells us things about health in all policies, and getting that into the policy process. And you talk about some of the tangible ways in which that can and can't be done. I wonder if you could reflect on those a bit. So what are the solutions? Where should we be looking to do something about this and make space for the right kind of evidence? And I'm using the term right a bit loosely there, but the good kind of evidence from a health and all policies perspective, the stuff that we need people to read. What can we do to get that into the policy process more effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously don't have an answer for this, but I can try and explore maybe some ideas. But just to give a bit of context about this particular point, that was a second strategy for me to avoid the lazy characterization of neoliberal determinism, is to try and like delve into, okay, where is this neoliberalism reproduced in a bit more depth, and that's where I drew on some research, for example, Justin Parkhurst, about the politics of evidence, and the limits of of what this sort of quantifiable, metric-driven, evidence-based policymaking kind of approach has. And so on one hand, of course, I can understand the starting point of a need for accountability and a need to like show results, that you can't just implement a policy because you think it's a good idea, but you need to kind of show that it has results. But of course, not as other people have said, not everything that is measurable matters, and not everything that matters is measurable. And the issue is that, okay, we are kind of it's almost like we're kind of in a almost an epistemic paradigm where this is the only way in which we can make sense of it. And so the question is, do we continue down that path and we try and refine it? And I mean, I'm no expert on complexity theory, but I think this is maybe what complexity theory is trying to do, is trying to kind of stay within that kind of paradigm, but just perfect it and try and really kind of find ways to model really complex relationship that ends up making a clear case for how certain aspects of capitalism are linked to ill health, which would otherwise be very difficult to identify. So maybe that will lead to a solution. Or, at the risk of going a bit postmodern now, do we need changes or new paradigms of thinking about knowledge and thinking about evidence, and I don't know how that would look like. But I'm thinking, and this is really just a thought, and I'd be really happy to hear, comments on that from the audience. But I'm wondering also, like, maybe whether, in that sense, public health can learn from, maybe Western public health can learn from non-Western kind of ways of thinking that kind of better integrate more holistically environment and humans and stuff like that. So kind of, yeah, change the knowledge paradigms more profoundly. But yeah, this is something for a future research agenda for me. It's not like I have a clear response to that.
It was a huge question, and yes, one also indeed. That which I asked you deliberately, but one also that we'll pick up, I guess, in the event on the 13th, because the other book that's being presented by Paul Kearney and Emily Sindeni and colleagues touches on exactly this kind of thing, right, on how we translate this into policymaking context, just to flag the event a second time, which I'll do at the end. I wanted, I'm going to ask you one or two more questions, and then I'll open it up. So if people want to put anything in the chat or prepare themselves to raise a hand or make an intervention, then please do so. But I'll just finish up with one or two more. One thing I wanted to do was just give you a chance to reflect on what's happened since you published the book. So because you were coming to the end of writing sort of as COVID was hitting in that way that was always doomed to complicate a writing project, but you handled that very well in the book. But I wonder if, given the time that's passed, you wanted to reflect a bit on what had happened since then, and whether you see any particular institutional or ideational or discourse changes that say something to your findings, for instance.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point, because I was just about to finish the book when when you had the pandemic and everything. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to have to change everything, or what am I doing? So I touched upon it a little bit in the introduction and in the conclusion, but it's not really addressing COVID that much. That, again, might be for a future project. But yeah, I think what's, I would imagine, fairly uncontroversial is that, okay, the EU's kind of role in on health has been really kind of showcased much more, and so you have much more engagement, like involvement of. I mean, there was a big leadership kind of push from the EU in response to COVID. Not immediately. I mean, of course, we all remember at the very beginning the sort of the issues with border closure and member states going back into their national kind of approach. But afterwards, I mean, the EU did play a really pivotal role, and so I think that is likely, and that I think a lot of EU health literature makes the point that EU health develops as a result of crises, kind of, there's more health integration after a crisis. And so I can imagine that after such a massive crisis like the EU, COVID, you can expect quite a bit of further integration in health. But then the question is, what kind of integration, And I think here what the framing of COVID and the framing of health in relation to COVID matters a lot, because on one hand you could think, okay, maybe the European Green Deal could be a good hook to do more about health in a more environmentally sustainable kind of social agenda. But on the other hand, I think what we're seeing, at least in part, is a stronger health security narrative, which of course is very understandable because COVID is an infectious disease, and so securitization in that sense, kind of better improving surveillance, improving tracking of potential emerging threats and so on is very important. But I think these two different framings could lead to very different ways of integrating in health, and they also both have their kind of trade-offs and advantages. And so, yeah, I think what we're seeing at the moment, especially with like new institutions like the Health Emergency Response and Preparedness Agency, HERA, this sort of thing is a really big push for health securitization, which then also kind of fits well with investment in AI and so on. So yeah, so that's kind of what I don't know what you think, Ellie, but that's kind of what I saw is seems to be the evolution of EU integration in health after COVID.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, when I got to the end of your book, I was thinking, using your framework of the institutions and then the ideas and then the discourses, I was thinking, well, there are some obvious institutional developments like HERA, but there's no fundamental change in the constitutional asymmetry right off the back of COVID. We're not seeing a new treaty competence that addresses that issue. So at a broad level, the institutional situation is maybe quite similar. But then I was thinking, well, that just means this is now a really interesting test case for the power of, from my perspective anyway, would be the most interesting part would be the power of individuals, right? Of individuals to use discourse to start challenging this, given the window of opportunity that's opened, or however we want to, whatever framework we want to use to think about that, given the chance that has been presented and the new political context that has been presented. This would seem like a really interesting time to investigate whether actually Commission officials have enough agency and power to be able to do something about this, or whether we've overestimated that a bit in our previous analyses. I mean, we as a field rather than you and me, but whether that's like we talk a lot about purposeful opportunism, particularly in health, and the power of individuals within the Commission to make quite a difference, and individuals within parliaments to make a difference. And there are definitely some examples where that's been true, but I think this is going to be a really interesting test case for exactly how good an explanation of the way things develop those sorts of models are. For sure. I'm very happy to open the floor at this point. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anybody wants to raise a hand, presuming that you all have the function to do so, then please do. While everyone is sort of deciding for themselves whether they're going to do that, I will plough on and ask maybe one or two final questions. The quick ones. The first thing was the first question I was going to ask is what thing you learned while you were researching the book that most surprised you? What was the thing where you just thought this is not, because to some extent we all know a little bit what we're expecting to find. What was the thing that you found that you weren't expecting to find?
Right. So I guess that it goes back to the very beginning of my research idea, which was not, when I started it was not health and all policies, actually.
Yeah.
I was going to research the diet platform, so the multi-stakeholder platform for physical activity, and I can't remember the exact name, for nutrition and physical activity, I think.
Yeah.
So a multi-stakeholder platform that brings together NGOs and industry to try and come up with solutions or improvements to diet related to NCDs. And I remember actually that I moved away from that because it didn't seem that relevant almost as a tool. So it was there because you have this multi-stakeholder, this need to come up with multi-stakeholder solutions, but actually very few people were seeing had a lot of interest in that, and it didn't seem to matter that much as a tool. And so, and so what interviewees kept telling me was they were talking about health and health policy as a more interesting concept. And so through sort of a knowledge co-production process, I was guided somewhere else, and then I started looking at health and health policies. And that led me also to doing a second fieldwork in Finland as well. And so I think it's really like what I've learned so much is really from the research participants, and also the realities of policy making and the constraints. Like I think, of course, I had a hunch that there are lots of constraints, that's obvious, but exactly how they manifest and how they are circumvented or how they are dealt with, that was really interesting, because that was very, very concrete. Like, for example, I was mentioning before the person who used the economic framing of health, not because it was their preference, but because they thought that was the best way to do it. There's also something about how when health was to be put on the EU agenda during the Finnish presidency, they presented it as a already common value rather than a new value to add, so that it would be easier to kind of present it as, oh, it's already a shared. So there are these very kind of concrete strategies that I thought was really interesting, because it finally kind of gave me a better insight into the realities of the policymaking constraints, or at least a little bit of insight into that.
And you account for them really well in the book, and they're I mean, it's very readable anyway, but they're a particular thing that makes it very readable, that there are these really practical, tangible examples of constraints to the way things are done, or reasons that things are done the way that they are, that are really easy to grasp and also really hit home as, gosh, yeah, that is how a human being would respond to that kind of constraint, and that's why we end up at a really practical level in the situation that we're in. Just thinking about so you went into this trying to address this question about, I guess, fundamentally why it is that health and all policies is there at EU level, but not as successful as its proponents would want it to be. Did the answer that you found to that question, which is multifaceted for sure, but fundamentally about this idea of structure and ideas and discourse, did that satisfy you, or was there any part of you that thought there was another part of it that needed to be explored, like obviously beyond the scope of the project that you were involved in, but is there something that needs to be researched next that would help to like fill out that answer in some way, or are you pretty sure that we now have a really good sense of why things are the way they are in terms of health and all policies?
No, I think there's always more to be researched, and I don't think this is a definite answer in any way. I think one thing that I've learned from the sort of is really a better understanding for why, like, I was perhaps initially being very naive about how radical ideas can be, and so this sense of how institutional change is ultimately very slow and very incremental. That's something that I guess represents reality in a way. I'm satisfied with the book, and I hope that the arguments can be thought-provoking and can make a positive contribution. I wouldn't necessarily say that I found the answer as such, because it was a very interpretive process as well. So I don't claim any kind of like, yeah, okay, so this is what it is and this is the truth, but it was really a sort of a learning process with interviewees, with the theories, so it was an interpretive. It's an interpretation of the failures of health and all policies and the limitations, right? And then whether the answers satisfy me personally, yeah, I think whether I find that this is hopeful or not hopeful, I think that almost depends from day to day, really, because we're like, especially in the current context of so many massive crises, I think sometimes I can focus on the fact that, yeah, it's not all predetermined. You do have scope for change, and so you can be optimistic. But on the other hand, the change is so slow that, given the gravity of for example, environmental crisis, I just sometimes despair as well. So it's a bit like in between, and will depend a lot on how I feel, basically. And then in terms of next steps, yeah, I think one implication of the argument I was making is the problem with silos, right? And how like areas that are not necessarily directly about health don't feel concerned about health. And I feel like actually in my book, to an extent, I'm guilty of the same thing because I've spoken to health policymakers. And so I find that why not look at possibilities or agendas or ideas that are not in health, not related to public health, whether they can offer a more kind of radical conceptualization of health promotion. So what I'm planning for the future, for my future research, is actually to look at more, critical movements that are critical of economic growth, for example, that relates the economic growth paradigm to certain issues, how health fits in that. Maybe seeing, maybe that would open up a little bit, the silos as well, seeing what health can contribute in that respect. And that's also as a result of my interviews with research participants, like drawing the links between ideas like degrowth and health promotion. So that's something that I want to explore a bit in the future. Yeah.
That's a really interesting section in the book when you talk about that that particular event on degrowth and some of the narratives that are going around there, and also that the link between that and that transition to sort of well-being economy and things as well, and how these ideas all get sort of bundled up into one another. It's that's a really nice section. There's I would describe it as a comment more than a question from Mary Rose in the chat, which to me speaks a little bit about commercial determinants. So she's noting the strength of the food industry lobby groups in the US and Michelle Obama's experience, trying to get the American, the Children Eating Healthier campaign that she had and coming up against these actors. I don't know if Mary Rose wants to add something or elaborate on that. I can't now see who's unmuted or not unmuted. I guess to me that spoke a little bit to the commercial determinants literature, right, which you and I have spoken about quite a lot, Charlotte, like how the stuff that you do and to some extent I do sort of marries up with that, and where particularly in terms of this sort of concept of political determinants of health that we keep bandying around, and where that fits into sort of distal and structural determinants, and where the commercial determinants literature might be able to help a little bit. I think my sense is that literature remains a little bit focused on agency over structure, and also that this quite narrow pool of actors that it's interested in at the moment, because it's still young and it's still growing, and that pool of actors gets bigger by the week, it seems. But the initial focus on sort of tobacco and alcohol things, industries, makes it for now maybe not as useful as it will hopefully be in the future. But I don't know where you see the overlaps between that literature and the sort of stuff that you've covered in the book on macrosocial determinants, I guess, is probably the obvious place where it comes in.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking the same, all the research on commercial determinants of health. And I think I don't talk that much on about commercial actors, but there is one element where, and actually that's like, you should be talking about it, Ellie, because it's the better regulation section, right? So it's about, there's a small section in the book that looks at how the governance of governance, so not just lobbying for, in relation to one particular decision, like, I don't know, a sugar tax or whatever, which of course is highly relevant, and the food industry has a lot of power in that. But even more fundamentally than that, the lobbying efforts to shape even how policymaking is done, which is, your research, Ellie, right now, I think is really interesting, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I was under the impression that this is the better regulation agenda is something that was also influenced a lot by the US. Is that correct?
Yeah, influence is probably a strong word, but the idea is definitely across the pond. Yeah.
So you see the sort of similar trends there as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I was also just in a meeting this morning, actually, where a colleague at Edinburgh was describing her work on the commercial determinants of what she's calling the commercial determinants of governance. So very much that idea that, okay, the commercial determinants of health literature is currently focused on corporate actors engaging in, like you say, specific health policies around the marketing of alcohol or fast food or whatever it is, and she's much more interested in the role of corporate actors in affecting governance structures and even what we think of governance as being. So multi-stakeholderism would be a really good example. So promoting this idea that good governance is multi-stakeholder and involves everybody and has lots of participation. And you talk in the book about how the health in all policies agenda actually was sort of co-opted a little bit in that regard, that multi-stakeholder was never meant to mean everybody, including the private sector and all of civil society. It was meant to mean multiple sectors within the public sector, right? And this comes back to that chameleonic problem, that if you define something quite vaguely and you strategically leave it a little bit to be interpreted, it can be interpreted in a way that is a bit, that undermines it as we go through the process, tying lots of things together there. Question from Claudine. Charlotte, what is your definition of health promotion in the context of your research, and what is your view on health promotion and health literacy? That's a really good question. Do you need a minute, Charlotte, or can you answer that right off the bat?
That's an excellent question, and it's so, I'm feeling so embarrassed to say that I don't even have like a very defined way of talking about health promotion, but I talk about trying to move from health promotion as understood as shaping behavior towards a radically more broad version of health promotion that would include, you know, I guess what I would refer to here is the concept of salutogenesis as opposed to pathogenesis. So there's a whole literature that talks about how health promotion should be more than just disease prevention at an earlier stage, because what I find is that health promotion is often taken to mean, okay, we need to do, you know, campaigns to tell people what's healthy eating, you know, to explain to people how to move better, maybe even like provide, you know, some better green spaces and so on. Well, although we're providing, yeah, and so this is almost trying to influence behavior is almost like disease prevention at an earlier stage, and so I'm wondering whether health promotion could mean something that is more like explicitly engaged with redistribution, you know, regulation, public spending as well. So ultimately something more political, but I am well aware of the issues with opening up a term to being political, because then, you know, it's just, on one hand, keeping it kind of biomedical protects it from attacks from outside, but on the other hand, health promotion is political. So the political nature of health promotion is something that I've kind of struggled with a lot. But yeah, I think the way in my research I think about it is very much in relation to inequalities and inequities. So policies that affect inequalities and inequities as should be considered as promoting or hampering health. So it's not really it's only a part of it, right? But it's the part that I chose to focus on because it's the part that I think relates most to the macrosocial determinants of health. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer the question. It's not a very good answer, I'm aware. But
how does health literacy
yeah,
fit into that, Charlotte?
and the health literacy, I think, yeah, again, also, if you take a radically broad approach to promoting health and you include, you know, health and well-being as well, and education is part of it. If you reduce inequalities and inequities and you know, education, like improve access to education, that also kind of improves health as well. So yeah, I think it has, yeah, obviously very important, has a role to play, but yeah, very multifaceted, basically. I'd have to think more about that question to come up with a better answer. Thank you for that question. It's a really good question, and I hope the answer is more or less okay.
I think you did very well. Other questions for Charlotte? Just pop those in the chat box. We have 10 minutes or so to pick those off, or raise a hand if you have the capacity to do that. I'm not quite sure what happened to the settings, but let us know if you want to chime in and ask Charlotte something. What's
yeah, I would also, I don't know if you know, if you want or not, but maybe Claudine, if you want to come in and tell me a little bit, because you're from Shoreditch Park Surgery. Maybe do you work in health literacy or? Okay.
Hi, Charlotte.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk. And I was intrigued by all of this because I'm currently doing a professional doctorate. I'm a dietitian by background as well, but I'm doing my research project in nutrition in sickle cell disease. So again, an area that is new, and I'm calling, you know, something into being that isn't at the moment. But looking at it from a perspective of nutrition integration into existing healthcare provision for sickle patients, but also looking at the role of health literacy, because like you mentioned, education and access to education is quite an important determinant of health. And then we know about health literacy also being an important determinant of health. And I think within my research, because it came sort of quite towards the end, so I've got about 6 months left of my doctor, quite at the end, but the whole concept of health literacy within the context of nutrition integration in sickle came like at the end, because I was trying to find a unifying concept, much like, you know, your conceptualization of health literacy. I was looking at, I've had individual sort of concepts, but trying to find almost like a unifying concept that brought all of my individual concepts together, and health literacy sort of fit that bill for me. So if you look at health literacy, you know, in terms of what's in the literature, it's taking a more of a health information type of sort of view, but people like Nat Beam, so they're looking at health literacy from a point of sort of the change, the decision making and the control aspects of people in terms of how they promote and maintain their health. But I, through my research and my findings and taking sort of, it's more of a qualitative type of study with service users and providers. But in thinking of health literacy, I've sort of gone a different way of looking at it, you know, away from just health information and looking at it in terms of service development, because that's where I'm going with nutrition integration, because that's where we are at. You know, we need to, in order for us to impact the health literacy, even from a health information perspective, we need to have service provision and we need to have policy and practice. So and we know that health literacy is linked to health outcomes, but in order to address health outcomes, you need policy and practice to inform service provision. So that sort of, that's the thinking of how I'm thinking of health literacy. So slightly different from what is sort of portrayed and reflected in the evidence. But the reason why I was asking that question was because, you know, you're the way you've tried to conceptualize health promotion as something bigger and a bigger narrative rather than what we have in the existing literature. I think that's why I've signed up to listen to your talk, because I wanted to just understand. This is all new to me. I mean, I'm sort of like, I never thought, you know, we're doing this kind of thing. So, but it's just nice to sort of hear how you've gone about with your conceptualization and how you've brought in things like the macro determinants of health, which I've done as well, looking at the traditional view of health promotion, I would say, where there is this socio-ecological model that sort of ties in with health literacy, where you've got your macro determinants of health. So it's through my research, I'm sort of drawing on all of these things in this unifying concept of health literacy, but as a way of informing policy and practice to inform service development within nutrition in sickle. So sort of quite a roundabout way, but, you know, that to me makes sense, that we can't go in with a narrow view like you've been alluding to. You can't go in this day and age, you can't go in with a narrow view. You have to take a wider perspective, and certainly within sickle cell and just understanding nutrition in sickle, I go in, you have to take a wider perspective, otherwise you're going to be losing out on so many important factors that actually affect the health outcomes, you know, for sickle cell patients. So, so hence my questions was to test what I know, what I'm thinking, sort of how does it compare with you, and also because you're looking at policy, and that's what I'm looking at as well through my research project. I'm actually developing a framework, a policy and practice framework to inform nutrition integration. And obviously health literacy as a unifying concept to support that framework based on the findings of my research project. So yeah, that's me.
It sounds like a really fascinating, almost micro level study of what Charlotte's done at the macro level to me, but I'm now way out of my field of expertise. So
so yeah, so that's
it sounds super interesting. Yeah, I was also thinking, like, I can really picture the same kind of dilemmas and issues arising where health literacy is just taken to mean here there's information and that's it. Whereas you're trying to do something much more kind of broad and multifaceted and complex and maybe normative as well. And I find it echoes well with how I try and think about health promotion and how you try and think about health literacy.
Totally. That's what drew me to actually sign up for the talk, because I thought I need to listen and understand, because that's how I conceptualize it for myself. And yeah, it's been really great just listening to your explanations and great questions, Eleanor, so that we can get a greater understanding of Charlotte's work. And but yeah, that's me. But thanks so much for allowing me to share as well.
That's really kind of you to say, Claudine, and thanks for coming on and sharing what you're doing and stuff. That's really useful context and lovely to hear from you. I do think the book, one of the things that Charlotte does really well, and I'm in a similar position here where I'm coming to the sort of macro social determinants and these frameworks that are a bit more public health rooted. They're still quite new to me. I'm coming to them quite late, and Charlotte does a really excellent job in the book of introducing those in a way that's really accessible for people that perhaps aren't so familiar with them and haven't seen them used to analyze something a lot before, because they're quite hard. It's quite hard to imagine when you're designing a research project how to bring those things in. I find they sit at a very high level, and the idea of being able to pull the macrosocial determinants of health in to try and assess a problem like sickle cell is like quite mind-blowing in terms of the different levels of analysis we're talking about. But I found the book a really clear example of an exposition of how to do that. So I would definitely put that as one of its strengths. I'm going to quickly address Marlene's the radicality of co-option dichotomy intriguing when thinking of studying process of institutional inertia. Yeah, and change. Studying both extremes. Yeah, that's a really good point. Marlene, I don't know, Charlotte, if you want to respond, we probably have 30 seconds for you to do that if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, the dichotomy, and study. Yes, I mean, I think that's really what I learned as well, because initially I went in maybe a bit naively thinking that it should be more radical, and then understanding like maybe it's not going to work if it's just too radical, So yeah, this compromise and the trade-offs and trying to spark institutional change. And I think also the theoretical framework I used is discursive institutionalism, which is a framework from Vivian Schmidt, from Jean Monnet professor from Boston, is really interesting because it looks not just at institutional change, which is often taken to happen after like a crisis, but also looks at dynamics of continuity, because we don't look enough at dynamics of institutional continuity. And I think that with HIAP, it's very interesting to see how ultimately continuity has been kind of imposed on the HIAP concept.
Particularly in relation to Marlene's point about transformative change as well, like this pressure to do stuff that's going to completely transform the way in which we govern health, when actually, in a way, what your book shows is that's almost certainly doomed to fail in some way, as Marlene is now pointing out. Yeah, good. I am going to have to wrap this up. I'm sorry, because we're approaching 3 o'clock and we should let people go. But Catherine has very helpfully asked in the chat if I can share the details of the event in London, which leads me nicely to say, yes, I most certainly can. So as I mentioned, Charlotte is going to be launching the book formally. It's a dual launch, right, with another book that I mentioned from other colleagues. So there'll be 2 books and 2 sets of authors and 2 sets of discussants. So we will be at City University of London, where Charlotte is based, on the 13th of October in the evening. We can put a link to that in the summary of this event, which will go on our website, on the EUHealthGov website shortly. And also, if you follow our Twitter account, we will be furiously retweeting the sign-up link for that event over the next couple of weeks. Is there anything you want to add on that event, Charlotte?
No, just that so the other book is called Public Policies to Reduce Inequalities Across Europe, Hope versus Reality. And then that's a really interesting book that addresses lots of different policy areas, so not just health, but also education, gender, and other topics. And so I think the 2 books will fit nicely together. You know, and if you're in London and if you can make it, yeah, we'll tweet about it and we'll share the details.
Yeah, certainly. I think the books are really well matched as well. So the other one is even further out of my field of expertise, but it's to me by the people who know all the stuff about evidence and policy and why we struggle to get the sorts of ideas that Charlotte's been talking about into policymaking processes. So I'm really looking forward to the cross discussion there about what the two books tell each other. I think that's going to be really nice. But for now, sincere thanks to Charlotte for answering some reasonably rigorous questions that I compiled for you there so gracefully, and being so very informative, and congratulations again on what was a really super read for me. I really enjoyed it and can 5-star recommend to everyone else. You did an excellent job, and thanks everybody for coming. Yes, in answer to Mary Rose, we will share the recording, that will go up on the website in a couple of days, but if you follow the Twitter account, we'll make sure you're all up to date on that. All right, thanks very much, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you.